Also, if you've been listening up, you've heard people complain like crazy about what's going on in California. Well, we started this year's Arcview forums in beautiful Santa Monica, and we did a magnificent breakout session on what is going on with the regulations. So this is great that now 6 months later, we can listen again to what is happening in California because it's so critical. It's such an important state to this business. And so we're doing a panel on, again, a very substantive panel with great domain experts on the California regulations, because you heard a lot of people say, July 1, this was hard to make those dates, and you're going to hear about that. So incredible domain experts. Our panelists are Pamela Epstein from Greenwise Company, Adam Spiker, who I met this morning, the director of the Southern California Coalition, Julie Crockett, Director of Compliance of a firm called MMLG, moderated by my friend and fabulous person, Lindsay Robinson, Executive Director of CCIA. I welcome you all to the stage. Thank you, Lindsay.
All right, hello. Nice to see everyone from this vantage point. We made it to the last panel on the last day. I'm glad you're all here with us, right? We got to celebrate. We're going to try to make this a little bit more lively, I would say, since we are the last panel. And we're going to be looking at a bit of a summary of the California regs and where we have been in the last 6 months. So hopefully there'll be some jokes, maybe some dancing. You never know. We're going to try to make it interesting for everyone. Very honored to be here. My name is Lindsay Robinson, and I'm the Executive Director of the California Cannabis Industry Association. We are a statewide trade association representing cannabis businesses. We focus primarily on policy reform in Sacramento and helping to shape a regulatory landscape where businesses can actually not only survive, but succeed. I know it's a novel concept for the cannabis industry to think about regulations like that, but that is what we are dedicated to. We represent about 465 businesses across the state and roughly 10,000 employees. So growing every day and helping to unify the voice of the industry, which is not an easy task by any means. And I am very proud to work with the folks on this stage. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their area of expertise. So we'll start with Dr. Julie Crockett.
Hello. My name is Julie Crockett. I'm the Director of Compliance for MMLG, which is a compliance consultancy firm in Los Angeles. I was recruited into the cannabis industry in 2015 to help launch a vaporizer brand out of LA. As a cannabis civilian, my background was in art school with a PhD in philosophy and being in a band. So I got recruited to launch this brand and was in Los Angeles and thought that everything was legal because there was dispensaries everywhere and I didn't really have any cannabis experience. And then I came to realize that I had just been put in control of an unlicensed company in Los Angeles. So I made myself their chief compliance officer and got very, very deep into regulatory compliance and helped guide that company towards licensure and compliance. And then was recruited by MMLG to spearhead their ongoing compliance services. So my area of work is in working in effect as a fractional compliance officer with many different operators, some small operators, some more established companies that may have internal compliance departments already. Because like I always say, it takes a village. It's an incredibly complex landscape that's ever changing right now. So I kind of have gotten to have a lot of experience this year kind of at the front lines looking at the innards of many different companies and the challenges that they're going through in this regulatory space.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Epstein, and I am the owner, founder, CEO, and managing partner of Greenwise Companies. We have a full-service consulting firm as well as a law firm, and I came to cannabis for a very personal reason. I had debilitating migraines. The doctors said we should talk about putting you out on disability, and as many of you know, when your stock in trade is your brain, you need that and don't want to go out on disability. So I was fortunate enough to live in San Francisco during that time and had a doctor that put me on a cannabinoid regimen, which I still use today. I then had to move to Arizona to be with family, start a different career. And at that time, I had to advocate for myself because I could take a bag full of opiates, and I was a loyal customer to that across state lines, but I could not take the medication that had been working for me. So I started Greenwise Consulting in Arizona, and I helped Arizona companies come to fruition. And my background is as an environmental land use attorney. So when California came into its regulatory renaissance back with MRSA, ironically a staph infection, I came back to California and was able to use my land use degree or my land use background to help applicants through that process. I worked for Sierra Club, so I was familiar with antagonistic, I would say, local jurisdictions with regard to development, and that's how Greenwise started. It helps operators along the supply chain, both through acquisition of licensure and the end of the beginning, as I like to call it, getting through your land use permitting process in order to become fully operational.
Hi, my name is Adam Spiker. I am a third generational government affairs consultant lobbyist, predominantly for local jurisdictions within the state. And I got involved in cannabis about 5 years ago, and it was because, back then cities were, and the elected officials, predominantly in Southern California, were coming to this realization that they had these elaborate, sophisticated, completely underground, unregulated, untested industries in their cities, and they couldn't do anything about it, or at least in their eyes, they didn't think they could. And we got involved trying to help educate one city at a time or one county at a time, and got into Los Angeles about 3 years ago, and I had much more hair back then, dealing with the city on how to give a pathway to the full industry, and created a trade association called the Southern California Coalition to just show more unity to the city so that we could negotiate Proposition M onto the ballot and try and we passed it at 80%, and now we're in the process of trying to finally get people through the licensing hurdles that are going through it, and I appreciate being here.
Great, thank you. So just to review, we did pass a historic moment in time on January 1st of 2018. Anyone who has been working and striving and struggling for legalization in California, it was a huge day. I know many of us shed a lot of tears that day, some out of frustration, many out of joy. It has been a tremendous effort. Activists really led the way. This movement was really rooted in helping AIDS patients in the 1990s, and the advocates were such a huge component to pushing us to where we are now. That has not come without challenges. Prop 64, we inherited a number of issues in statute, including very high tax rates and a huge amount of local control. The local control in some ways has been good. It also has been incredibly difficult to create kind of a unified network across the state of ordinances. Each locality can choose the ordinance that works for them. Many across the state are choosing a complete ban, which essentially is still prohibition. And as we know, prohibition is a failed effort. It results in a loss of tax collection on regulatory goods. In the past, it has resulted in many, many people being arrested and going to jail. And so it is really important that we talk about and think about the issues that we are facing now. So while we have this reason to celebrate, which I know many of us are very excited about, We also have a great deal of challenges, and some of them have been highlighted throughout the panels the last 2 days. But I want to talk specifically about July 1st and ask the experts on the panel, maybe starting with Dr. Crockett, what went into effect on July 1st and the challenges that came along with that deadline.
On July 1st, it was the end of what was called the transitional period for the California cannabis market, and some of the biggest impacts, I'm sure everyone will have bits to share on it, but one of the biggest impacts was that there were packaging and labeling requirements that kicked in. From January to July 1, people were able to fulfill a child-resistant requirement at the retail level by putting products into an exit bag, a resealable child-resistant exit bag. And there were labeling aspects that could be completed and fulfilled at the retail level where certain required stickers and labels could be put on at the retail level, so that it allowed this 6-month sell-through period in effect for back stock. It's interesting, the Department of Public Health had said that in the time between January to about June, they had received almost no questions from operators regarding the packaging and labeling requirements at the end of the transition period. And it was only in those last few weeks when, in some ways, when operators began to realize that this deadline wasn't going to be pushed, these requirements were going to come into effect, that many people were left scrambling to fulfill this requirement that at the individual package level, every product had to fulfill this child-resistant requirement. In some cases, a resealable requirement where child resistance was maintained if it's in the case of an edible. There were potency requirements that shifted where products up until that point that like edibles that had been over 100 milligrams per package were able to be sold for medical use only, and that ended. And new testing requirements were introduced that, as we've discovered, many of the labs were unprepared for, and many of the products were unprepared for, so that on July 1, the command from the agencies was that retailers could no longer carry these products that had not cleared this testing, and that all of those products that didn't fulfill these requirements and could not be remediated had to be destroyed.
Right, so I think there's a lot of good takeaways from what happened on July 1 for businesses as they continue on this road towards compliance. Ultimately, the biggest beneficiaries of July 1 were the consumers. They can now be assured that products that they receive from licensed dispensaries all the way up the supply chain are going to be compliant, are going to be tested. What does that mean for operators? That means you have to early adopt. You don't want to be scrambling at the last minute as these continual changes that are coming from the regulatory level are there. So from your investment perspective, make sure that they are investing in compliance protocols, not for compliance for today, but compliance forward thinking. You don't want to be at the very bare minimum of compliance. You want to be setting the standard of compliance. Because as we see this continual rollout, that's what's really going to separate what we can say the boys from the men, is that you are thinking about this issue as what differentiates you in the marketplace. Testing is going to be continually difficult struggle. We have, 29 testing labs, maybe 19 of them are actually operational, and of those, potentially 9 have the correct equipment for phase 2 testing, which now applies to anything harvested after July 1 or manufactured after that date. So if you're harvesting now and manufacturing now, you're going through phase 2. So it's a real struggle throughout the entire supply chain, but one that ultimately results in better products and a more sustainable future for California cannabis.
Yeah, I wouldn't really have anything else to add to that other than I think what you're seeing is the state, doing their job in trying to force the transition into regulation and trying to avoid any more delays in that, which I think is to the betterment ultimately. The quicker we can expedite that process, the better it is for licensed businesses, and the more pressure you can put on local and state regulators to go after the unlicensed ones. That's probably the only thing I'd add to it.
Great. So how are things in LA? First of all, I think all three of you are from that general area, and I think LA is one of the most complicated landscapes in California, and also slated to be one of the biggest markets in the state. So the July 1st, deadline and sort of changeover has affected cannabis companies across the state. How has that compounded the issue in LA specifically?
You want me to go first?
I do, yes.
So LA is, they're just severely behind in the process. They'd taken a couple of different attempts at giving recognition, but only to stores in the past, going back to 2007. And so they had, I would equate it to like a chessboard that has pieces all over the board. They couldn't really reset the board and start from ground one. And the biggest takeaway to me is the timing again. The quicker folks start getting their ability to get licensed, which is supposed to start August 1st with temporaries for supply chain operators that have been supplying product to what they call the EMMD retail shops. The biggest thing I see in that is the hurdles that the city is potentially putting in the way of that temporary authorization. They just added within about 3 weeks ago a mandatory public hearing for all phase 2 operators, and that's probably a 60-day hurdle. And right now they're saying that you have to do that along with your safety inspection, your on-site inspection, before you're even eligible for a temporary authorization. And if anyone here is invested in any business that has to deal with some of our bureaucratic entities in the city of LA, you're going well past January 1st to get even a temporary, which the state said is no longer going to be doable. And so we're working through that, and we need as many people, as many prominent voices trying to push them into what is the rightful position, again, getting people into the regulated market as soon as possible.
I think that leads us into the comment period. So, Lindsay, do you want to start us off, or do you want me to?
Yeah, no, please take it away.
So we are in what is known as a 45-day comment period for the draft permanent regulations. We are actually on day 37 of that 45 days. And so what Adam's saying is very true. If in the draft permanent regulations, they are going to cease issuing temporary permits as of December 31st. So if you are lucky enough to get through the LA process and get your temporary local authorization, you can go to one of the 3 regulatory agencies and get your temporary permit. That gives you or entitles you only to a 120-day runway. So that means if the state can't process all of these applications, and it is important to note in this instance, they have not issued one annual permit for any operator that needs to be in track and trace. So that is your production and retail supply chains. So they would need to process all applicants that had priority, meaning that they were operational prior to January 1 of 2016, in all of that suite. So everybody that is currently operational, and then they're only going to do the priority processing as it is currently drafted until January 1 or through the end of 2019. So that means if you couldn't get through your annual permitting, and in the draft permanent regulations as an environmental attorney, you have CEQA requirements. For any of you that do development in the room, you are probably familiar with the CEQA process in that it can take months, if not sometimes years. And in this instance, the Bureau has made themselves the lead agency, and they have said if they deem that you are not CEQA exempt, that you have to give them essentially a blank check, and you have to pay for the Bureau's time for the time of the application that it takes to go through CEQA, And until you are done with that, you are not an annual licensee, and there is no more 90-day extensions if this starts to take place in January 1. So for LA operators specifically, even those that are pre-ICO, those are still issued only a temporary permit from the city of LA and need to go through their process. From a local jurisdictional perspective, the only city that has done CEQA correctly to exempt the project, not the ordinance, is the city of West Hollywood, who has not made cannabis a change of use. They said that if you are a commercial business or manufacturer and you step into the shoes and you take over that real estate, that property, you are CEQA exempt. No other ordinance in the state has done that, and in fact, the city of LA deems cannabis to be a change of use. So these are very important, critical questions that you as investors want to be aware of and make sure that your operators are commenting, and can go to CCIA or any of us and ask how to make those comments. Julie, would you like to share?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a cause of Pamela and I lately. We're going on a road tour just to talk about this comment period constantly, because as she said, there's 37 days left of this comment period. These are the draft permanent regulations. So this is the last opportunity for the industry to actually exercise some immediate and impactful change of the regulations as written, not just the new changes proposed, but anything in these regulations that has proven to be unwieldy, difficult, doesn't make any sense, all of those issues. This is the industry's opportunity to do that. And the comments can be submitted individually, you can email them, you can snail mail them, you can go to one of the many public hearings that they hold, but also it's a huge time and opportunity to lean on some of the established organizations and trade groups like CCIA. I'm a board member at CCIA and the chair of the legislative committee, and the committee system there is incredible in terms of having very informed, intelligent people getting together, able to hash it out. They brought in outside legal counsel to be able to draft professional, effective comments and to even create supporting white papers. So those kind of systems are an incredible asset at this moment to be able to not just submit your individual comments, but to come together as an industry and for the operators to join forces to really sign on support to these issues, because there are some major issues. As Pamela was saying, that deadline of saying no temporaries will be issued or extended after December 31st of 2018, that was a new addition in this latest round. It's not in statute, it was something that was introduced. So as we discovered in the re-adopt of the emergency regs, where they put in a requirement, for example, for 24-hour security guards at retail, and the public commenting was so impactful about that, it got pulled out even in a 5-day period. You cannot underestimate the importance of this period of time for the operators and for the industry and for just any concerned bystanders to actually submit these comments and really articulate them in clear, effective ways. So the agencies have put out guidelines on how you do an effective comment. Anybody that has a tie to any business, that would be a number one question to ask those operators is, what are you doing about this comment period? How can you facilitate attention to this? How can you, give some resources to allowing people to really sit and focus and compose these comments? A very exciting thing about this comment period is that the agencies are required to answer each one. So these will be matters of public record, and if you present a comment, they have to respond to it, and they can't just be comment noted. They have to actually respond to say either why they didn't adopt it or give you some other information about why it wasn't feasible or that they did choose to adopt it.
Yeah, I think, as many of us know who work and live in California and sort of live and breathe this process, it is extremely complicated, but it's ever evolving. And we have seen that the regulators in California are going to take a very heavy hand. this is an opportunity for us to give feedback on how that actually affects how people run their business in the state, whether they're cultivators or manufacturers or distributors or testing labs. This actually is an amazing opportunity for us to influence how those regulations turn out. There is a disconnect. I think we all know that. We hear that from our members all the time, that the regulators don't understand how the cannabis industry works. I will say that I think for the most part, even of the governor's office and you know, the relationships that we have worked really, really hard to build with the regulators so that they can hear this perspective from the industry, I think their heart is mostly in the right place, but again, it's a heavy-handed regulatory system. And so figuring out how to operate in it and be a successful business and see investment opportunity, it can be challenging, but I do think that there are reasons to be optimistic, which I really want to touch on so we can end on a positive note. But first, I'd love to ask each of you to comment a little bit more on what you're seeing in the draft permanent regs that we are now fully digesting. And I don't know if you all heard Chief Ajax yesterday and Amy Jenkins sort of discuss the fact that the draft permanent regulations came out on Friday the 13th, which I think is very telling. But what are you seeing as some of the big changes, and how might that affect investors?
I'll go first. I think to me, the state's doing a very good job. I would say they have been receptive when there are issues that have come up, because they realize, like you said, they don't know everything, and so they've been very adaptive. The one that sticks out to me is I don't think it was necessary to have two different types of license, medical versus recreational. So streamlining that seems to make a ton of sense. I think as well them having some flexibility for like a type S type license where you can have shared space for operators. You know, those are things that I think are promoting the ability for small businesses to stay in this, because that was an overarching theme of all this from the beginning. While we all know this is going to be about making money and bigger business and probably some, you know, a lot of contraction, just seeing from what other states have done, it's still, I think, a theme of this is for the small operator too. And so those are some good changes I think they're making in that vein.
I think for the investors in the room, it's understanding the ownership and the financial interest and what that means. They are encapsulating a significant amount. Everybody will likely fall into one of those two categories. A financial interest holder is proposed to be anybody who has an agreement to receive profits from a commercial cannabis business. They are getting after the meat of that issue. They've also made changes to make transferability easier. Now, that is a great condition at the state level. What everybody needs to understand is in a dual licensing system, just because the state says that you can transfer and maintain operations as long as one owner stays on, that is not the case in the majority of local jurisdictions where there is an anti-transferability language, usually which is reflective of an ownership change. So even if your entity stays the same, if you are substituting in owners, that can trigger a null and void of your license. So just because the state is saying one thing, it is not paralleled at the local level. So it's important to have that understanding, and also know that as an owner, there are 12 items, if you don't have a conviction, that you have to deal with, that you need to provide to the agency and potentially be live scanned by the DOJ. So that's always something I think investors should be aware of.
Real quick, what I would just say on the transferability, I think it's a really good point, but I think a lot of the local municipalities that we've worked with, I think there's intent behind that, because they're doing a vetting of that applicant, and so they don't want to vet the applicant and then have them just be able to sell that license immediately. So we've seen a lot of flexibility with that, you know, where maybe a year later they relieve that. And so since so many cities and counties have just started that process, I think you'll see some flexibility on it. But it's a good point to bring up. Just because the state allows it, everything starts local in this industry.
100%.
Just again to reiterate those aspects of the deadlines that were introduced in terms of the cutoff on licensing. And one of the big changes is if I was a child-resistant packaging company that had started up expecting to serve the California market, that was a big shocker for many in the regulations, was that they removed the child-resistant requirement in these draft permanent regulations, which is to say anyone operating now still has to be in child-resistant packaging, but there's the possibility come when these regulations are adopted in November, December, that might be removed. The experience from some other states where there's been some flip-flopping on that, where they had child-resistant packaging, then they removed it and went back to exit bags, then they went back to child-resistant packaging. So if anything, it just demonstrates the volatility of this rulemaking process and how radically some things can change, and that it is very difficult to as a business and as an operator to maintain a nimble structure to be able to respond to these things. Just real quick back to LA, the heartbreaking tragedy that we're witnessing is, for me, my most compliant clients, who are the poster children of doing this right, are doing the worst. Are bleeding from the eyeballs of suffering in this with the taxes and with the lack of pathways to compliance for unlicensed operators to level a playing field. It is incredibly difficult for the people who are trying to do it right to sustain through this process. And that's where I hold my fear is that what's going to happen to these businesses over time if they don't get that kind of institutional support for making the pathways through these transitions, because they're incredibly onerous upon the operators who are currently active.
Agreed. And what we see is the more barriers to entry and barriers to success for compliant companies means the illicit, unregulated market continues to thrive. They don't operate under testing standards. They don't pay taxes, and they threaten the compliant businesses that truly want to be a part of a regulatory system, and that's a huge issue for the entire industry. And I know we've gone over, and I know that we want to say some positive things. So my positive thing to end note, from a broader perspective, we have seen arrests drop by 56% for cannabis-related crimes in California since Prop 64. That's my positive. If you want to make any projection, maybe 15 seconds.
I would just say, as crazy as it has been for operators, it has been an incredible opportunity to actually function under emergency regulations, as opposed to some other systems where you're just given a set of final regulations from the gate that you have to live with, and that it's huge legislative lifts and very difficult to make changes. The fact that California has had the opportunity in this past year to experience the hiccups and see the problems and have that kind of evidence to share with the agencies is actually a very powerful tool for change.
I think that consumers in California are so much better off now that we have a regulated system. They're getting clean product. They're getting tested product. This product comes in doses that you can understand and work with so that we don't have those problems. And on the flip side, that gives operators a mechanism to look at a compliance window and maintain that and continue to grow and continue to provide the residents of the state of California the best medication and products that they can. So that is
awesome. Yes. Adam, final words?
Yeah, I would say as investors, you guys have a great opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom with some of the things we talk about from a regulatory standpoint, but the opportunity right now to get ahead of the curve and get into the industry, what I am seeing is cities and counties are now starting to look at this politically as economic development for their cities that are severely underwater budget-wise, like they would any other industry. If you were a hotel developer, cities would come and talk to you about what they're going to give you. We are seeing that with other cities, and it's only going to get better, but I think we all focus on the bigger cities that just can't get out of their own way, namely LA. But that would be my takeaway, is the time's now to get ahead of it, because when they do change this federally, the competition within investment is going
It's
to
going to be huge. Yeah, absolutely.
significant.
Well, I know we're all super grateful that we were able to chat with each other and be up on stage today. Come and chat with us afterwards. Thank you to my expert panelists. Very
And
much
please
appreciate it.
comment.
Thank you. Comment.